The energy substrates that we will focus on are carbohydrates, lipids or fats, and proteins. Carbohydrates are basically large linked chains of molecules. Starch and glycogen, which is a storage form of glucose, are examples of these molecules called polysaccharides. These are broken down and digested to become two-part structures called disaccharides, then finally the absorbable form, monosaccharide, like glucose and fructose. Glucose is the main fuel for energy in our body, so its availability, storage, and formation is important. Glycogenesis is the formation of glycogen from glucose. We do this after a meal when there is plenty of glucose, so we want to store some for later. The way we store glucose is in the form of glycogen. After a while, before our next meal and when blood glucose levels begin to drop, the ability to break down the glycogen to get some glucose again is called glycogenolysis. Gluconeogenesis is the formation of glucose for energy when we have no glucose available. Our body needs glucose, particularly our brain, which won't take anything else. When we have to convert other non-carbohydrate things into glucose, these processes are biochemically messy, creating a number of byproducts that we would be better off without. However, this is a great backup against starvation and a remarkable means of maintaining energy and brain function. The use of glucose for energy begins with glycolysis in the cytoplasm of every cell. Glycolysis forms just 2 ATP, but many more are to come from the 2 pyruvic acid molecules and 2 NADH coenzymes also produced. The Krebs cycle occurs in the mitochondria of our cells. Acetyl-CoA is what enters the Krebs cycle. Pyruvic acid from glycolysis can be converted to acetyl-CoA, but so can fatty acids and proteins. The Krebs cycle can also yield a couple of ATP, but more NADH and FADH2 coenzymes. This is where the carbon dioxide comes from. The coenzymes are moved to the electron transport chain in the inner matrix of the mitochondria. It is this process that requires oxygen. Oxygen is used to generate ATP from the coenzymes NADH and FADH2. This is where the bulk of the ATP is generated. The process that every cell goes through to produce ATP from one molecule of glucose requires that glucose first go through glycolysis in the cytosol. This produces 2 ATP molecules, 2 NADH molecules, and 2 pyruvic acids. The ATP can be used immediately for a number of ongoing cellular activities. NADH is like a token for more ATP, but it has to be converted in the mitochondria through the electron transport chain. Pyruvic acid moves over to the mitochondria and is converted into acetyl-CoA, making another NADH and releasing a carbon dioxide molecule in the process. Acetyl-CoA enters the mitochondria to enter the Krebs cycle, also known as the citric acid cycle. This is named for the 1953 Nobel Prize winner Sir Hans Krebs. Once in the Krebs cycle, the acetyl-CoA molecule produces 2 more carbon dioxide molecules, 3 more NADH molecules, and 1 FADH2 molecule, which is another token that will yield ATP in the electron transport chain, and 1 ATP molecule. Remember that all of this came from 1 pyruvic acid molecule. There's still another one to go. The NADH and FADH molecules enter the electron transport chain, converting it to ATP. This conversion into ATP requires oxygen. Each NADH molecule will yield 3 ATP, except the NADH produced from glycolysis in the cytosol, which yields only 2 ATP, as it took some energy to get it into the electron transport chain. Each FADH2 molecule will yield 2 ATP. Thus, 1 glucose molecule yields 2 ATP in glycolysis, then 2 more from the Krebs cycle, and finally 28 ATP from the NADH and 4 ATP from the FADH2 for a total of 36 ATP. If the demand for ATP increases, such as when we exercise, then all we do is deliver more oxygen and glucose by increasing the delivery of blood. If our exercise intensity increases and we continue to need even more ATP and the oxygen delivery is maxed out, then a backlog of pyruvic acid begins to build up. If we can't get more NADH and FADH through the electron transport chain than we already are, and the body still needs more ATP, then the only choice is to run more glucose through glycolysis. The pyruvic acid builds up, but since the mitochondrial activity is limited by how much oxygen we can actually get there, then the pyruvic acid has to wait. The cell does not like the buildup of pyruvic acid in the cytosol, so much of it is temporarily converted to lactic acid and sent out into the blood. Note that although this process is called anaerobic, there is still a lot of oxygen converting ATP in the mitochondria. It's just that we can't get any more. We have as much oxygen going through as we possibly can, but we can't shuttle any more. So the lactic acid is the result of the spillover. The anaerobic pathway is the formation of ATP from glycolysis to make up for the extra demand for energy. As the exercise intensity declines and the person can catch their breath, the lactic acid returns to the cells to be converted back to pyruvic acid, then proceeds through the mitochondrial processes to produce ATP. If we were to exercise regularly, then the body adapts by increasing the number of vessels supplying the working muscle, as well as the number of mitochondria in the cells. This increases the exercise capacity by moving more pyruvic acid into acetyl-CoA into the mitochondria, allowing more ATP production before reaching that lactic acid threshold. Anything that allows more oxygen to move the NADH and FADH2, the more energy or ATP can be made and the more exercise a person can do. Here is the energy yield for 1 molecule of glucose.